Sorry there, DM, but according to the rules as written, that cool finishing move that Jimmy just did on the final campaign boss is not valid. None of it happened. As we can see on page 257, section 2, part B, that totally awesome thing that he did that everyone cheered and high-fived over can't happen. So we're gonna have to retcon that and go back to normal round-by-round combat. Isn't this so much more fun now?
I personally think tabletop RPGs are some of the most rewarding experiences a group can do together. Constant social interaction, group storytelling, coordination, teamwork, problem solving, and critical thinking. It's not only a rewarding bonding experience for the entire group, but it helps to develop the individual as well. The downside is that the vast majority of tabletop RPGs are also some of the most complicated games you can play. Games whose rules are ever expanding, updating, and changing with detailed books that are a mixture of history texts, dictionaries, encyclopedias, and convoluted instructional mechanical references. Not all RPGs are equal on the complexity of their rules. And the players of the games also don't have to know all of the rules of the system at any one time. In this video, I don't want to talk about the rules of any particular system, but rather how we handle and interpret them in general. A common theme in RPG systems is there's a single leader that runs the game, known as the Dungeon Master, Game Master, or Storyteller, etc. The onus to know the greatest amount of rules is usually set upon his or her shoulders, but no average person can remember the entirety of the rules in perfect clarity. The rest of the group is usually referred to as the players. The players really only have to know the rules pertaining to their particular characters, or whatever they represent. So the amount that they need to know is dramatically less. This brings me to my first main point. Players, your knowledge only has to be a narrow focus of your character, so please at the table, know your shit. Once again, no average person can have perfect memory, but you only have a limited selection of rules and tools to use. So to make the game run smoother, I reiterate, know your shit. That is the simplest and most straightforward point I have to make about rules. So let's touch about something a little more complex and can sometimes even be a source of contention within the RPG community. How to actively interpret the rules on a game-by-game basis. Now, there are normally two terms that are thrown around a lot when it comes to interpreting the rules. There are rules as written and rules as intended. During a recent YouTube discussion video, Matt Colville sort of introduced the term rules as played, which I personally like really well as well, because that's something that I actually do. I just never really had a term for it before. So these three terms are almost different methods of interpreting the rules. That doesn't mean you have to stick to one or the other. Many people do a mixture of all three. I do. Firstly, rules as written. Sometimes people will just refer to this as raw. These are the exactly worded rules in the various rule books for the RPG system you're playing. There are many players out there that are sticklers for the rules as written, believing that wandering from these exactly worded rules is somehow unfair to the game balance. That a GM that strays from raw may slide down a slippery slope of just constantly changing rules to suit their whims and fancies, and if that happens, then the players really just turn into spectators, as they have no baseline foundation to work off for their control. In some ways, I think those players are a little bit right. I have personally experienced this happen to me, and it ruined the entire game. We found ourselves just sitting there, listening to someone tell his own story with no real input from us, which can be interesting sometimes, but yeah, you're there as a player, you're there to do something, right? However, the rules as written aren't perfect, especially with how different each group is from each other. I personally see nothing wrong with changing the rules as written, as long as you retain a high level of consistency in those changes, and set your expectations with your players ahead of time on what's going to change. Consistency is key. I believe I've mentioned this in previous videos. This leads us to rules as intended. Oftentimes you'll come across rules in the more complicated systems that were clearly meant to do a particular function. Unfortunately, due to poor wording or lack of foresight for a system interaction, the rule itself doesn't function mechanically how you think it was meant to. So in this mindset, you create a baseline in your group on how you think it should have functioned as it was intended. This is changing your rules as written for several specific rules to suit your group using a consistent baseline and predetermined expectations. You're interpreting the rules as you believe the creator of the system intended them to be played as, or intended to work as. But we can go even a step further than this and go with rules as played, ignoring how a rule is actually written, or even that the developer of the game intended it to be. You might decide as a group that a rule just doesn't work for you as written or intended, so you change it to suit your collective playstyle to make the game run that much better for you. You change the rule to how you actually want to play with it, hence rules as played. Because in the end, almost every RPG out there makes the same suggestion, that the rules presented in the official rulebooks are just a suggested framework, a framework for you to modify and build upon for your own creative endeavors. There's nothing wrong with limiting yourself to a particular rule set if that's what you enjoy. This is especially true in most organized play like Pathfinder Society or D&D Adventures League, places where it may be important to make sure entire groups of strangers always have a universal baseline to work off of. But for those home games, where you really just get to stretch your creative GM muscles, Game Master muscles, don't be afraid to tinker as long as you keep two things in mind. 1. The game isn't just yours alone. Everyone playing at the table is part of it as well. Talk with them and make sure they're okay with any changes you want to present, any changes you want to make to the game, and go forth. And 2, as I mentioned earlier, be consistent with those changes and set expectations ahead of time. Don't surprise players with sudden rule changes. It's frustrating, annoying, and can rob the players of what little agency they have, things you don't want to encourage when playing a game. Rules as written, rules as intended, and rules as played. The 3 ways to interpret and utilize the rules of any RPG. Feel free to mix and match, because in the end there's literally only one goal to the game: for everyone to have fun. And as long as you aren't making someone uncomfortable, you can't have fun wrong. So, have a good one, eh?